In this tutorial, you'll learn how to finish a quilt with a beautiful contrasting binding. Let's start with the supplies you'll need. First, a quilt that needs binding, or in my case, a hot pad, quilt binding, and if you're making your own, I recommend a strip of fabric 2.25 inches wide, folded in half lengthwise with wrong sides together. You'll need your sewing pins, matching thread, a fabric marker or tailor's chalk, a quilting ruler, and of course your sewing machine and iron. Start with your quilt right sides up on your table and begin pinning the unfinished edges of the binding to the raw edge of your quilt, making sure to leave at least a 3-inch tail of the binding unpinned. Also, if your quilt has curved edges like mine, try not to stretch the binding too much or you might create puckers later. Just let it lay naturally around the edges. Stop pinning when you reach about 2 inches from where you first started pinning. Then trim the second tail of your binding to about 3 inches to match the first tail. Next, we need to make a beautiful seam to overlap and join the ends of the binding. Start by overlapping the tails of the binding along the edge of your quilt to fill in the gap. Once you have them laying the way that you want, make a mark on both binding tails right at the center of the overlap, just making sure that your markings line up with each other exactly. Next, lift the binding strip tails away from the quilt with right sides together, match up the markings you just drew, and pin them together. Then grab your quilting ruler and draw a straight line through the bias tape tails going through the marking on the top bias tape tail. Once you have your stitching line drawn in, take your quilt to your sewing machine and simply sew the bias tape tails together along that line. Just make sure to keep the fabric of your quilt out of the way so you're only sewing through the binding tails. Make sure that your freshly seamed binding fits perfectly along the unsewn portion of the edge of your quilt. If it doesn't fit, unfortunately you will have to seam rip it and resew the seam to get it to fit more precisely. If it does fit, go ahead and trim the binding tails to about 1/4 inch and press them open. You can then finish pinning this last section of the binding to the edge of your quilt. Once you've got the binding pinned all the way around your quilt, go ahead and take it to your sewing machine and stitch the binding to the quilt by sewing around it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, if you want a narrower binding like I did, you can trim your seam allowance down by half, but if you like a wider binding, go ahead and just leave the seam allowance wider. Then fold the binding up and over the seam allowance to the wrong side of the quilt and pin it in place. The folded edge of the binding should extend just past the stitching on the wrong side of the quilt. Finally, with the binding pinned in place, take your quilt to your sewing machine and, stitching from the right side, top stitch just inside the binding around the edge of the quilt. This should catch the folded edge of the binding on the wrong side and secure it in place. Give your quilt a good pressing with lots of steam, and you have now sewn a beautiful bound edge on your quilt.